This is discussion 14A, although it's the only part of discussion 14. I want to step back. We just talked about the Mongols, and I want to talk about a really cool idea that it's a theory that a retired climate scientist named William Ruddiman put out. It's called the Ruddiman Hypothesis, and it has not yet been proven true or false. There's some evidence to support it, and there are some problems with it. But I want to just give you this idea. It's a really cool idea to think about, and it's a really interesting way to think about history. First of all, Ruddiman's a climate scientist, and he points out that the Earth has always had natural cycles of ice ages and then warm periods and cold periods and warm periods lasting millions of years. And these cycles happen on for a number of different reasons. I mean, for one, the Earth changes its axis of tilt toward the sun over the course of millions of years, and so as it does that, sometimes the Earth is more pointed toward the sun, and sometimes it's more pointed away. And then there are other natural variations in things like the distance from the sun, and then differences in the sun's intensity. There's also things, and it's a really complicated formula that climate scientists have figured out about how climate changes. And what's interesting about this is that the climate models predicted that beginning somewhere around 8,000 to 5,000 BCE, the Earth should have started back down into a cooling period that would have produced another ice age. So we should be in an ice age right now. We're not. And so Ruddiman says, well, I wonder what could possibly have caused this ice age not to happen. And one of the things that Ruddiman points out is that we can actually use things like ice cores, which is where you drill down into a glacier and you go really deep into the glacier and you pull out a circular tube of ice, and it's got all the layers of ice in there. And so actually the ice the ice was formed often thousands of years ago, and those ice cores can show us what the composition of the atmosphere was when that ice was formed. And so using ice cores from Antarctica and Greenland and other places, and then there's other ways that the climate scientists can check out what the composition of the atmosphere was in the past. Ruddiman points out that normally when you have an ice age, what happens is the CO2 levels and methane levels in the atmosphere start to drop, and this is one of the driving causes of an ice age. But Ruddiman points out that for some reason, between 8,500 and 5,000 BCE, the CO2 levels started to go down, and then they leveled out and they started to go up. And he says that nothing in the sort of natural cycles of Earth's history could explain why CO2 levels would suddenly change directions and start going the other way. Well, Ruddiman then comes up with his idea, his hypothesis. He says, if you look at it, this is right when agriculture is starting. Right? This is when agriculture is starting in Mesopotamia. This is where agriculture is starting in China. This is where agriculture is starting in Egypt. And he says it's possible that agriculture was actually changing the greenhouse gas composition. In particular, he says, if you look at what's going on with agriculture, the first thing is there's massive forest burning. Peoples everywhere are burning down forests to create open land for agriculture, or we saw with Harappa, they're cutting down forests to make bricks for cities, or et cetera. But basically, the advent of agriculture involves deforestation, and we know that forests are actually carbon sinks in the sense that plants take CO2 out of the atmosphere and they separate the oxygen and the carbon. They release the oxygen back into the atmosphere, but they take the carbon, and that's what the plant makes itself out of. That's how plants grow. And so forests are essentially these huge masses of carbon that have been taken out of the atmosphere and then stuck in the ground. And forests, because a tree lasts so long, it basically ties up that carbon for hundreds of years, and then gradually releases that carbon back as it decays, etc. But forests are basically these huge carbon sinks where you can lock up carbon for hundreds of years. But if you burn a forest, you're essentially releasing all that carbon back into the atmosphere immediately. And so Ruddiman says all the forest burning that human beings were doing, even though they weren't doing this on a huge scale everywhere in the world, but they were doing enough of it, he said, they were essentially releasing a whole lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. Second, he says, If you look at China in particular, China was one of the major population centers in the world. China was burning down a lot of forests to create agricultural fields, and in southern China in particular, they adopted wet paddy rice cultivation. And wet paddy rice cultivation, as I mentioned in previous lectures, where rice grows better if you flood the field. You build up a rim around the field, and then you flood it with about 6 inches of water, and rice grows better in that circumstance. But he says that all that water standing there creates enormous amounts of decay, which releases CO2 and methane into the atmosphere. Third, he says, domesticated animals. Human beings are domesticating animals, and so the populations of certain species of animals are growing because human beings are breeding them and creating situations where those animals can reproduce to the best of their ability. But domesticated animals, especially like cows, they produce methane by their digestive processes. So they burp methane, they fart methane, and so they are releasing methane. Right? And even today, the beef industry is one of the major producers of greenhouse gases, especially methane, as part of our problem with greenhouse gases today. So basically, Ruddiman says, I wonder if you can't look at human history and say, is there a correlation between the climate and human populations? Or to put it slightly differently, when human populations go up and there's more people doing agriculture, does that cause CO2 levels to go up, which in turn causes the temperature to go up? And then at times in history when the population goes down, does that cause CO2 levels to go down and then cause the climate to get cooler? That's the Ruddiman hypothesis. The question is, can we look at human history and figure out exactly if this lines up? Do the numbers actually line up? Well, Ruddiman looks at human history and he says, at first glance, the numbers seem to line up pretty well. He says, first of all, we know that there was epidemics in 430 BCE that killed a significant number of people, and we actually see CO2 levels go down somewhere around that time. But then the CO2 levels keep rising again from the 400s BCE up until about the 200s CE. And at that time, we know that there's a period during the Roman Empire that they call the Roman Optimum. This is also the Han Dynasty, where the climate was actually a degree or two warmer and more stable, and it had higher CO2 levels. And so Ruddiman says, well, maybe, after this huge die-off in this plague in the 400s BCE, human populations levels grew again over the next several hundred years, and CO2 levels rise, and we get a warmer climate for this period called the Roman Optimum. But then the temperature starts to go down again in the late Roman Empire, and this is one of the things that actually helped cause the collapse probably of the Roman Empire and maybe the Han Dynasty, is global temperatures got a little cooler. And that shortens growing seasons, and it creates more rain, and it does all sorts of things that can mess with your agriculture. Well, one other thing we notice is that there were waves of plagues. There was a plague breakout from 160 to 189 CE under the Roman Empire. There was another plague breakout 251 to 266. And then there was the massive Justinian plague that I talked about from 540 to 542, and then it continued up with outbreaks until the 600s. That might have killed off perhaps 25% of the world's population. And therefore, we could see that there would be significant areas that are going to have less agriculture, that farm fields will be left to go fallow because there's nobody to work them. And Ruddiman says this corresponds to CO2 levels and to temperatures, that we get into a cold period with lower CO2 levels from about the 500s to about the 1000. And then it starts to go up again. And in particular, we get this period called the medieval warm period, which is essentially from about 1000 to 1300, the temperature is about 1.5 degrees higher, and CO2 levels are higher, and this leads to an absolute boom in population in Europe, but also in China. And essentially, that leads to the growth. And so Ruddiman says maybe that growth was because of higher CO2 levels were causing warmer temperatures, which were helping agriculture, which is helping human population growth. Then, and this is where Ruddiman's hypothesis really gets interesting, he says beginning in the late 1200s, early 1300s, the temperature starts going down and the CO2 levels start going down. And he says, what could have caused that? Well, his answer is the Mongols. That in the 1200s, the Mongols managed to kill off so many people that they actually significantly reduced the amount of agriculture happening in the world, and that this might have caused CO2 levels to drop and might have caused the beginning of what we call the Little Ice Age. That essentially from 1300 to 1800, there was a period of climate change. And there's a lot of debate about this. Some climate scientists now say the Little Ice Age didn't happen as a whole. It might have been just regional in Europe or parts of China, et cetera. It might not have happened to the whole world. But we certainly know that beginning of 1300, the climate in Europe started getting colder. And there's some evidence that the climate in China might have started getting colder. And so that beginning of 1300, and Ruddiman's hypothesis is basically, okay, you've got the Mongols killing millions of people in the 1200s, the late 1200s, and then, they're in the mid 1200s, and then you have, in the 1300s, you have the Black Death, which kills a significant portion of the world's population, which might have pushed it even farther down. But then we know that in the so-called Little Ice Age, or this drop in Europe for sure, and maybe China, happens in the 1300s, then there's another significant dip in the 1600s. The CO2 levels go down, and the climate starts to shift again. And there, Ruddiman points to a different hypothesis, which is that beginning in 1492, Europeans are in contact with the Americas, and we know that Europeans unwittingly, inadvertently, released a whole slew of epidemic diseases, right? The mumps, measles, smallpox, all sorts of diseases that were common in Europe and Africa are now transferred to the Americas, and the American populations have no immunity to this. Their bodies have never seen these diseases before, and so they're what's called virgin soil epidemics, which means that they have really high death rates because nobody has an immune system that can handle these things. And so we know that the population of the Americas between 1500, right after Columbus arrives, and about 1650, the population of the Americas drops by about 90%, meaning there's only about 10% as many people in the Americas in 1650 as there were in 1500. And a big part of that is epidemic diseases wiping out whole populations. And so Ruddiman argues that essentially there is all sorts of agriculture happening in the Americas, and when the population drops 90%, that again pushes the temperature down. And of course, Ruddiman says the temperature stays down until the 1800s, at which point it starts to rise steadily, and that's because the Industrial Revolution, through the burning of coal and et cetera, starts pumping huge amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and it starts to cause the temperature to rise again, which is what we have going on now. Now again, the Ruddiman hypothesis, I'm not a climate scientist, I don't know all the ins and outs, I don't know how to evaluate this, but Ruddiman is a climate scientist. He laid out his hypothesis. It lines up pretty well, right? It's not. There are some details that might not work, and there's been some questions lately about how much the actual changes in temperature are real. But the CO2 levels we can measure with the ice cores, and we can roughly correlate this to the population levels. And there have been some climate studies that seem to support the Ruddiman hypothesis. There have been others that sort of question it. There have been others that have not found any conclusive correlation, which means that it would question the Ruddiman hypothesis. It's still up in the air, but it points to an interesting connection between human agriculture and climate, and therefore human population and climate, that we really hadn't been aware of before throughout most of human history.